The tank destroyer was already burning when he climbed onto it. I remember the sound first. Metal popping. Fuel hissing. A low, animal roar as fire chewed its way through steel. The air was thick with smoke and snow at the same time. Ash drifted downward like black snowflakes, settling on white fields that moments earlier had been quiet, almost peaceful. Now they were torn open by artillery craters, broken trees, and bodies that did not move. Everyone else was pulling back. I could see them retreating through the trees, American infantry, exhausted, half-frozen, moving because stopping meant dying. Their unit had been shattered. Tanks knocked out. Radios gone. Officers either wounded or dead. And in the middle of that collapse, one man climbed onto a burning vehicle and stayed there. His name was Audie Murphy. The battlefield before courage. It was January 1945, near the village of Holtzwihr, in eastern France. The war was supposed to be almost over. At least, that was what people said. Germany was retreating. The Allies were advancing. Maps showed arrows pointing east, thick confident arrows that suggested momentum and inevitability. But standing there, knee-deep in snow and mud, inevitability felt like a lie. The Germans were attacking. Not cautiously. Not desperately. But with precision and weight. Infantry advanced in disciplined lines, using the trees for cover. Behind them came armor, dark shapes moving slowly, confidently, like predators that knew they were stronger. American positions collapsed one by one. Machine guns fell silent. Mortars ran out of ammunition. Men screamed for medics who could not reach them. Audie Murphy was 20 years old. He looked younger. Short. Thin. A face that still carried something close to a boy's softness beneath the grime and exhaustion. He had already been wounded before. More than once. He had already seen enough death to last a lifetime. But on that day, none of that mattered. What mattered was that his company was being erased. Retreat. The order came without ceremony. Fall back. It wasn't shouted heroically. It wasn't delivered with speeches or flags waving. It passed from men to men in looks, in gestures, in the simple understanding that staying meant annihilation. Audie Murphy helped drag wounded men toward the tree line. He fired when he could, short controlled bursts, buying seconds. Seconds were everything. A tank destroyer nearby had been hit. Flames climbed its side, licking at the exposed ammunition. The crew was gone. Either dead or already retreating, I never saw them. The vehicle burned like a signal fire. And then Murphy did something that made no sense. He ordered his men to keep moving. And he stayed behind. Alone. I remember thinking it was a mistake. Not cowardice. Not confusion. Just the kind of mistake that happens when the body is too tired to argue with the mind. He climbed onto the tank destroyer, using the side armor like steps. Flames were close enough to singe fabric. Smoke wrapped around him, turning him into a silhouette. He lay flat against the metal and reached for the mounted .50 caliber machine gun. It was still operational. The enemy was close now. Very close. German infantry emerged from the smoke and trees, moving forward with the confidence of men who believed the fight was already won. They were advancing into what they thought was empty ground. They were wrong. The machine gun came alive. The sound was deafening. A deep, tearing rhythm that cut through everything else on the battlefield. Snow jumped where rounds struck. Trees splintered. Men fell. Murphy fired into the advancing infantry, walking the gun left to right, again and again. He was completely exposed. No cover. No support. No retreat. Just a single man, on a burning vehicle, firing directly into an attacking company. Fear, up close. I could see his hands shaking. Not from fear exactly, at least not the kind people imagine. It was exhaustion. Cold. Adrenaline tearing through a body already pushed too far. Artillery began to fall around him. Shells exploded close enough to throw snow and earth over the tank destroyer. Shrapnel screamed through the air. One burst struck the vehicle itself, sending sparks and fragments outward. Murphy did not stop firing. The flames beneath him grew hotter. Black smoke poured upward, choking and blinding. At any moment the ammunition inside the vehicle could have detonated, turning the tank destroyer into a bomb. He stayed. He fired until the barrel smoked. He fired until German infantry stopped advancing and began to scatter, unsure of what they were facing. From their perspective, it must have seemed impossible. An entire unit had been driven back. Yet here was resistance. Violent. Precise. Unyielding. Time bought in blood. Minutes passed. On a battlefield, minutes are an eternity. Behind him, unseen but not forgotten, American soldiers regrouped. They reloaded. They treated wounds. They reformed a defensive line that should never have existed after the collapse. Murphy was buying them that time. Every burst of fire was an act of defiance. Every second he remained alive rewrote the outcome of the fight. German tanks began to reposition. Infantry sought cover. Their advance stalled, then slowed, then stopped entirely. From one man. From one burning machine. Wounded, still standing. A shell burst close. This time, fragments tore into Murphy's leg. I saw him flinch. Saw his body tense. Blood soaked into his trousers, dark against the snow and soot. He did not leave. He adjusted his position and kept firing. His radio was gone, destroyed earlier. But somehow, through smoke and chaos, he managed to direct artillery fire by shouting coordinates to nearby men when the gun finally fell silent. Even wounded, even nearly overcome by smoke, he remained in command. Only when the Germans finally pulled back did Murphy climb down. He could barely walk. But the line held. Aftermath. The field was quiet again. Not peaceful. Never peaceful. Just empty. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some half covered by snow. The tank destroyer still burned, its flames lower now, as if exhausted by their own fury. Murphy collapsed once he reached friendly lines. Only then. Only when the impossible had already been done. What courage looked like. Later, they would write it down. They would measure the action in sentences and citations. They would count enemy casualties and list weapons used. They would attach medals and call it valor. But standing there, watching it unfold, courage looked very different. It looked like staying when leaving was logical. It looked like action taken with full knowledge of the cost. It looked like a young man choosing responsibility over survival. Audie Murphy did not change the war that day. But he changed the battlefield. And everyone who saw it knew they had witnessed something that could never be reduced to words alone. Silence on a battlefield is never clean. When the firing stopped, it did not feel like peace. It felt like something holding its breath. Smoke still drifted low across the ground, curling around shattered trees and broken bodies. Somewhere in the distance, artillery continued to rumble, not here, not now, but close enough to remind everyone that this was only a pause. Men moved carefully. Not because they feared the enemy returning, but because the ground itself felt dangerous. A misstep could land you in a crater. A glance too long could force you to recognize a face you knew. Audie Murphy lay on the ground, propped against a tree. His face was pale beneath the soot. His leg was bleeding freely now that the adrenaline had faded. A medic worked quickly, hands practiced, eyes refusing to linger. Murphy stared ahead, not at the medic, not at the men gathering around him, but at the field where the Germans had fallen back. As if he were still there. As if the fight hadn't ended yet. The cost reveals itself. Courage has a delayed price. It does not arrive during the act itself. During those moments, the mind narrows, sharpens. There is no room for reflection, no space for fear to fully form. The body acts because stopping is not an option. The cost comes afterward. It comes when the hands begin to shake. When pain pushes through the haze. When memory starts to replay what the eyes could not process at the time. Murphy's wounds were serious. Shrapnel had torn muscle. Infection was a real threat in winter conditions like these. He was evacuated from the line, lifted onto a stretcher that sank slightly into the snow under his weight. As they carried him away, I saw his head turn. One last look at the tank destroyer. It was still smoking. The men who lived. Back at the line, the men he had saved stood where they now could stand because he had stayed. They spoke little. Some stared out at the trees, scanning for movement that would never come. Others sat down hard in the snow, finally allowing their legs to stop shaking. A few looked toward where Murphy had been. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They understood something instinctively. What they had just witnessed was not something to be loud about. It was something that changed you quietly. History moves in. The war did not pause to reflect. Within hours, orders arrived. Units repositioned. Maps were redrawn. The battlefield of Holzwehr became just another marked location on an operational chart. But stories moved faster than paperwork. Word spread through the regiment, then beyond it. A man who had held off a German company alone. A burning vehicle. A machine gun fired until it could fire no more. Details blurred as stories always do, but the core remained untouched. One man. One stand. Against overwhelming force. Courage, recorded. Later, much later, the act would be examined with the cold precision of historians and officers. They would reconstruct the scene. Time of engagement. Enemy strength. Friendly casualties. Weapon systems used. They would conclude, correctly, that Audie Murphy's actions had been decisive. That his stand allowed his unit to regroup. That it prevented a breakthrough. That it saved lives. They would award him the Medal of Honor. The citation would describe bravery above and beyond the call of duty. Those words were accurate. They were also insufficient. The weight of survival. Murphy survived his wounds. That fact alone is sometimes treated as a footnote, but survival carries its own burden. The body heals faster than the mind. Even as his leg recovered, something else had lodged itself deep inside him. Nightmares came. Loud noises made his body react before his thoughts could intervene. Sleep was shallow, restless. He had seen too much. He had done too much. Courage, when examined closely, is not clean heroism. It is not a shining moment preserved perfectly in memory. It is messy. It leaves scars that no metal can cover. Murphy rarely spoke about Holtzwehr. Not because he forgot it, but because he never truly left it. What I remember most. When people ask what courage looks like, they often imagine something dramatic. A shout. A charge. A moment framed perfectly against the sky. What I remember most from that day was quieter. It was the moment before Murphy climbed onto the tank destroyer. For a brief second, he stood still. Not frozen. Not hesitant. Just still. As if acknowledging the reality of what he was about to do. There was no bravado in that pause. Only acceptance. The nature of the act. Audie Murphy did not act because he believed himself invincible. He acted because he believed the situation demanded it. That distinction matters. True courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important. In that moment, Murphy chose time over safety. Chose others over himself. Chose action over survival. And once that choice was made, there was no room left for doubt. After the war. Years later, photographs would show Murphy in uniform, medals heavy on his chest. He would become famous. Recognized. Celebrated. But fame did not quiet the nights. The war followed him home. It followed him into his dreams, into his relationships, into the spaces where silence should have lived. He had faced an army without flinching. But the memories were harder to fight. Why this moment endures. Many acts of bravery happened during the war. Thousands, perhaps millions. So why does this one endure? Because it strips courage down to its most elemental form. No strategy. No reinforcement. No promise of survival. Just a single human being standing between destruction and delay. It reminds us that history does not only turn on grand plans and massive movements. Sometimes it turns on moments so small they almost go unnoticed at the time. A man choosing to stay. The battlefield revisited. If you stand near Holtzwehr today, the land looks calm. Fields stretch outward. Trees grow where others were cut down by gunfire. Snow still falls in winter, quiet and indifferent. There is no sound of machine guns now. No smoke. No fire. But the ground remembers. Even when people do not. What courage is not? Courage is not fearlessness. Courage is not a desire for recognition. Courage is not certainty of victory. Courage is action taken without guarantees. Audie Murphy did not know his stand would work. He did not know he would survive. He did not know anyone would remember. He only knew what needed to be done. The lesson that remains. Watching the day unfold taught me something no book could. That courage is not a personality trait. It is not something you are born with or without. It is something that appears under pressure, shaped by circumstance, forged in moments when there is no perfect choice, only necessary ones. Most people will never face such a moment. And that is a blessing. But knowing that such courage has existed matters, because it redraws the boundaries of what we believe is possible. The final image. When I think back to that day, the image that stays with me is not the gunfire or the explosions. It is the silhouette of a young man on a burning vehicle, framed by smoke and snow, refusing to move. Not because he was fearless, but because he understood what would happen if he did. Time does something strange to moments like this. It does not erase them. It does not soften them. It isolates them. Years pass. Wars end. New conflicts rise and fall. Names are replaced by other names. Dates blur together. But certain moments remain intact, sealed away from decay, as if history itself knows they must be preserved exactly as they were. That day at Holzweiler is one of them. Distance does not diminish it. I have stood on many battlefields since then. Some were larger. Some were louder. Some involved more men, more machines, more destruction. But none felt heavier. Because scale does not define courage. Clarity does. And at Holzweiler, clarity was absolute. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone knew what the likely outcome would be. Everyone knew that staying meant death. Except one man stayed anyway. The story as it became history. Eventually, the story was written down. Not as I saw it. Not as it felt. But as history requires, measured, verified, stripped of emotion. Official records described how a second lieutenant mounted a burning tank destroyer. How he used its machine gun to repel an enemy attack. How he directed artillery fire despite being wounded. How his actions halted an advance and saved his company. All of it was true. None of it captured the weight of the air. The smell of burning fuel mixed with blood. The way the snow absorbed sound until every gunshot felt impossibly loud. History records facts. Memory records atmosphere. What was never in the citation? No citation mentions the moment just after. The moment when the gun fell silent and no one moved. The moment when men looked at one another, unsure whether to breathe. The moment when survival felt undeserved. Those things are never written down. But they matter. Because courage does not end when the action stops. It echoes. It reshapes those who witness it. It leaves a permanent mark on how they understand fear, responsibility, and choice. The men beyond the moment. Audie Murphy would live many years after that day. He would wear his medals. He would smile for photographs. He would become a symbol. But symbols are simplifications. The real man carried Holzweiler with him always. He carried the faces of men who did not make it back. He carried the knowledge that his survival had been a matter of seconds, angles, luck. He carried the understanding that courage had asked everything of him, and would keep asking, long after the battlefield was gone. Courage is not reusable. People like to imagine courage as something that can be summoned again and again, unchanged. It cannot. Each act takes something with it. Murphy paid that price quietly, in sleepless nights and restless days. In a body that reacted before the mind could catch up. In memories that returned uninvited. The world celebrated what he had done. The world rarely asked what it had cost. Why this story endures. This is not a story about winning a war. It is not a story about tactics or strategy or national triumph. It is a story about a human limit, and what happens when someone steps beyond it, not because they want to be remembered, but because the moment demands it. Audie Murphy did not change history alone. But he proved something essential. That even in a mechanized war, driven by mass and machinery, the individual still matters. That a single decision can alter the fate of dozens. That courage is not obsolete. Standing there, years later, I returned to that place once, long after the war. There was no fire. No smoke. No sound of guns. Only wind moving through trees that had grown back taller than the ones destroyed. I stood where the tank destroyer had burned. There was nothing to mark it. No monument. No sign. Just ground. And yet, it felt different. Not sacred. Not dramatic. Just aware. As if the land itself remembered being asked to witness something extraordinary. What we owe to such moments. Stories like this are not meant to glorify war. They are meant to clarify something else. They show us what people are capable of when stripped of comfort, certainty, and choice. They remind us that courage is not loud by nature. It does not announce itself. It does not explain itself. It simply acts. And then it leaves the rest to us. The final understanding. If you ask why Audie Murphy climbed onto that burning machine, there are many answers. Duty. Training. Responsibility. But none of them are complete. The truest answer is the simplest one. Because no one else could. And because in that moment, he accepted that reality without looking away. The last image I keep. I do not remember Murphy as a decorated hero. I remember him as a silhouette. A small figure against smoke and flame. Snow falling through gunfire. A battlefield holding its breath. I remember thinking, not for the first time, and not for the last, that courage does not look the way we expect. It looks fragile. Temporary. Human. And that is why it matters. Closing words. This story was written into books. It was engraved into medals. It was preserved in archives. But its true value lies elsewhere. It lies in the reminder that courage can exist even when survival argues against it. That sometimes, history turns not on armies, but on one person who refuses to step back. Audie Murphy stood alone that day. So that others could live. And long after the gunfire faded, that choice still speaks.